Okay, so I want just to remind you, in the series that we had talked about, we've been talking attachment styles. If you have not had a chance to go back and listen to those is totally fine. We're going to link all of the episodes, but we are in kind of this part 3. You don't need to have, like I said, have listened to the other ones, but we've done like an overview of all of the attachment styles. We've done a episode on dismissive avoidant, then we moved into anxious preoccupied. And like I said, I'll have them all linked in the show notes. You can go back and listen. But the interesting thing about fearful avoidant is it's kind of a blend of the last 2 we've talked to in some ways.
And the thing about fearful individuals, they experience both anxiety and avoidance, and they want to be in close relationships, but they lack the confidence and security in themselves, their partner, and their relationships. And this is also the rarest form of the attachment styles, which I think is very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And again, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good.
But I want to remind you guys, and we've kind of said this in some of these past episodes, humans are so dynamic that it's so interesting to say, you fit in this box, you fit in this box, and there's only 4 boxes that you could possibly fit in. So I think it's probably kind of where you're the most dominant. Somebody may want to argue that. I just think that's interesting to call. I guess I can see where it's the rarest, but yeah, interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people with anxious attachment styles they're constantly seeking more intimacy, and they want to be reassured in their relationships. Sometimes they can come off as needy partners, whereas people with an avoidant attachment style tend to do the opposite and really push others away out of fear of intimacy. Also, people with fearful avoidant attachment style tend to either have a really troubled relationship or a stressful, distant one that lacks that real intimacy or commitment. And it's usually because of the way that fearful avoidant person may behave in the relationship.
Yeah. And again, kind of back to our point of that it's almost a blend of that dismissive and anxious, because they're anxious to have connection, but then as soon as they get to a point where there's connection, they flip and they go to this like more dismissive where they don't want to have that relationship. And in fact, I was reading on verywellminded.com. I will link this in the show notes. They actually quoted some research by Van Buren and Cooley, and also some by Murphy and Bates. And what they found, that these people with this attachment style tend to, view them, they have a lot of self-criticism that accompanies the fearful avoidant attachment style, which will leave them to be more vulnerable to depression, social anxiety, negative emotions in general. And then meanwhile, in that other study, they were talking about the comparison to the other attachment styles. So the other 3 fearful avoidant attachment styles, these people tend to have more sexual partners in one lifetime, and they have a greater tendency to consent to sex even when it's unwanted. And again, I'm assuming that's because of that want to have connection and closeness, but they're avoiding that serious relationship. They're avoiding that deeper connection to, actually having a, a close emotional relationship, because that leaves them vulnerable. And so sexual relations give them that connection, but not the long prolonged courtship. And it never actually quite turns into that. So typically they have prolonged courtships. They don't like to have titles. You're not going to typically find them in relationships with labels. They tend to be in more casual sexual relationships. They're big friends with benefits kind of people situations, lots of cake and have it too. But it's to protect themselves. I mean, that's typically what's happening. People do things out of fear.
Right. I'm going to go over some signs that you can look for, and you can see if this resonates with you to help you to know if you're fearful avoidant. Have a negative view of themselves and others, have difficulty connecting with others, have an extreme fear of rejection, Feel rejection is inevitable in any relationship. Feel unworthy or inadequate. Want to be close with others, but also may push them away out of fear of being hurt. These are just a few. There's lots of other ones, but these ones kind of stand out, and that's why we want to give you that information so that hey, that kind of sounds like me, and then you can further research it.
This is just like all the other attachment styles, they start in childhood, but they can also be reinforced by other relationships, which I think is interesting about the attachment styles. I've kind of mentioned that in the last episodes, that that piece of that it can be reinforced as relationships go on. It's like information that you're it's that whole AI concept. Like that's why they try to make computers like us, is because we continue to collect information and then take that information, and that's how we show up in the world, right? So same concept. Our attachment style continues to develop, but most of it is that core beginning, right? From our parents, from our caretakers. So typically, if you have fearful avoidant, you were more than likely may have had some abusive situations as a kid, or you were neglected, especially with like primary needs. Some interesting things that may have been said to you also is like if you showed emotion, they might tell you to stop crying or grow up or toughen up. And typically the caretaker would become angry. They'll physically separate from the child. Um, and then the child will try to attach, right? And so they'll start suppressing their emotions, to kind of caretake for their caretaker, right? And you were just sharing off the podcast an
Yeah.
interesting note too.
Yeah, just another interesting note about this attachment style is it's kind of a high risk for people that have this tend to get into abusive relationships, and I think that's kind of interesting too. Because
Mm-hmm.
they're coming from a place of abuse, and then they sometimes end up in that type of a romantic relationship as well.
Well, it's like what we see all the time, right? Is this is why these patterns repeat, because it's what you know. And you would to me you would think it wouldn't, you would think that you would want, and I'm not saying that they end up in these relationships because they want to by any means. So that's not what I'm saying. I just think it's interesting the way the human brain works, is we just know what we know, and we just generate that, and we tend to attract that back into our life, so we end up in these abusive relationships unless we get help to break those. That's why it's generational trauma. That's why it continues to replicate over and over again. I wish humans weren't made that way, but it's the way we're made. And this is where it shows in attachment styles, right? You grow up in an abusive, abandoned kind of like abandonment circumstance, and you end up in that same thing as a romantic relationship because your brain knows what to do with it. It just does. You know how it goes, and so you tend to end up in those relationships. So I'm so glad you brought up that point, because that's even more reason why it's so important to do work. Like
Yeah,
all of
for
us
sure.
need to do work.